Dolly Madison. Most people picture a first lady as someone who stands beside the president at events, smiles for portraits, and stays decoratively in the background. Dolly Madison had no interest in that version of the role. She hosted political gatherings at a time when women had absolutely no formal place in American politics. And those gatherings were not social events in the casual sense. They were where deals got made, where alliances formed, where the business of the young republic actually happened over dinner tables she controlled. James Madison was quiet, cerebral, not particularly gifted at the kind of human warmth that moves people. Dolly provided everything he lacked in that department, and did it so effectively that she was arguably more popular than he was for most of his presidency. When the British marched on Washington in 1814 and set the White House on fire, she stayed long enough to save a full-length portrait of George Washington and important state documents before finally leaving. James had already gone. She was the one who decided what the young nation couldn't afford to lose. If you're finding these files worth opening, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. There are 7 more women in this particular file, and the stories only get more surprising from here. Eleanor Roosevelt. The distance between what a first lady was supposed to be in the 1930s and what Eleanor Roosevelt actually did is almost impossible to overstate. She held her own press conferences, which she restricted to female journalists only, forcing newspapers that wanted access to hire women. She wrote a daily syndicated newspaper column called My Day that ran for nearly 2 decades. She traveled the country independently, visiting coal mines, hospitals, military bases, places Franklin's polio made difficult for him to reach personally. She pushed him consistently on civil rights in ways that made him politically uncomfortable, and he didn't always listen, but she didn't stop pushing. After he died, she didn't retreat. She became a delegate to the United Nations, helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and continued operating as a significant global figure in her own right well into her 70s. Franklin Roosevelt was a great president by most historical measures. Eleanor operated on a scale that didn't fit inside any title anyone had given her. Edith Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke in October 1919, and for the next 17 months, the United States was effectively run by his wife. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not a conspiracy theory. It is what happened. Edith decided who was allowed to see the president. She filtered his correspondence, determined which matters were brought to his attention, and in some cases, signed off on decisions herself. She called it a stewardship, insisting she was simply protecting her husband's recovery while transmitting his wishes. Critics at the time called it a petticoat government. What it actually was, functionally, was an unelected woman making executive decisions for a country of over 100 million people during one of the most consequential periods in modern history, the aftermath of the First World War, the fight over the League of Nations, a country in significant political turbulence. She did all of this without a title, without a vote, and without any constitutional authority whatsoever. History has never quite decided what to do with that fact. Hillary Clinton. She arrived in the White House in 1993 with a law degree, a policy portfolio, and zero intention of limiting herself to the ceremonial. Bill Clinton gave her the Healthcare Reform Task Force to lead, which was an actual governing responsibility, not a ribbon-cutting exercise. And the reaction from Congress and the press was fierce enough to suggest how far outside expectations that decision fell. The healthcare effort failed, partly due to political opposition and partly due to strategic errors, and Hillary absorbed a significant portion of the blame in ways that shaped how cautiously she moved for the rest of the presidency. But the ambition never went away. She ran for Senate in New York in 2000, won, and served 2 terms. She ran for president in 2008, came closer than any woman had before, and then served as Secretary of State under the man who beat her. She ran again in 2016 and won the popular vote. The arc of her career makes the First Lady chapter look like the beginning of something, rather than the definition of it, which is exactly the point. Nancy Reagan. The extent of Nancy Reagan's influence over her husband's presidency was an open secret in Washington for years before it was publicly documented. She consulted an astrologer named Joan Quigley to help schedule Ronald Reagan's diary, a detail that became public after his second term and produced considerable controversy. But the astrology was almost a distraction from the more substantive influence she exercised. She pushed out senior White House staff she didn't trust, including Chief of Staff Donald Reagan, whose departure she engineered with a directness that surprised people who had underestimated her. She shaped the public presentation of the presidency with meticulous care, understood instinctively how her husband was perceived, and intervened when she felt the people around him were not serving him well. Ronald Reagan was famously difficult to read, even for those closest to him. Nancy was the person who actually knew what he needed and made sure he got it, which in practical terms meant she had more access and more influence than most of the cabinet. Imelda Marcos. She is remembered most often for the shoes, 3,000 pairs discovered in Malacañang Palace when she and Ferdinand fled the Philippines in 1986. And the shoes are real, and they do represent something genuine about the scale of excess involved. But reducing her to the shoes misses what she actually was, which was not a passive beneficiary of her husband's power, but an active participant in building and maintaining it. She held official government positions. She negotiated with foreign leaders, including Muammar Gaddafi and Mao Zedong, on diplomatic missions Ferdinand sent her on, because she was, by most accounts, more charming and more effective in those rooms than he was. She controlled significant portions of government spending and accumulated personal wealth on a scale that was staggering, even by the standards of authoritarian excess. When the regime fell, she was tried for corruption, convicted in some cases, and returned to the Philippines anyway. Her children entered politics, she won a congressional seat herself. The shoes became the symbol, but the power behind them was always the more interesting story. Winnie Mandela. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison on Robben Island, and during those years, the anti-apartheid movement needed a face that was present, visible, and willing to absorb what the South African government was prepared to do to someone who refused to be quiet. Winnie was that face. She was surveilled, harassed, banned, and forcibly relocated by the apartheid government in sustained attempts to silence her, and none of it worked for long. She kept speaking, kept organizing, kept the movement alive at a personal cost that is difficult to fully account for. By the time Nelson was released in 1990, she had become a political force entirely independent of him, with her own following, her own positions, and her own complicated history, including serious allegations that followed her from the 1980s onward. Their marriage did not survive the reunion, but the role she played during those 27 years, holding something together almost alone, under conditions designed to make that impossible, is not a supporting story. It is its own story, and it belongs in any honest account of how apartheid ended. Eva Perón. She was an actress from a poor provincial background who married Juan Perón in 1945 when he was a rising political figure in Argentina, and what she built from that position over the next 7 years reshaped the country in ways that outlasted both of them. She was not a traditional first lady in any sense. She ran a ministry, she held rallies that drew hundreds of thousands of people, she personally distributed money, food, and resources to the poor in ways that built a loyalty so intense it bordered on devotion. She fought for and secured women's right to vote in Argentina. She was more beloved than Juan among the descamisados, the shirtless ones, the working-class Argentines who were her actual constituency, and Juan understood that her popularity was the engine of his political survival. She died of cancer in 1952 at 33 years old, and the national grief was unlike anything Argentina had seen. People stood in lines for hours to pay their respects. She had never held the presidency and never needed to. The power she exercised was real, regardless of what the title said. Stay fascinated by the women who ran things from rooms history forgot to mention. Stay curious about the ones who never needed the title to hold the power, as we keep her files classified.